Okay, so we are going to continue now with our discussion of Jonathan Swift for a few minutes before we move on to our last two poets. And then we're going to be ready to move on to the review for the final examination. So let's go back to Gullivers Travels. At the end of our last segment, I was talking about how Swift uses certain techniques, rhetorical techniques. The technique of the persona, of course, or mask, in which this is not Swift speaking, nor is Gulliver really speaking with Swift's voice here. Gulliver is, as it were, a kind of character created by Swift for the purpose of conveying certain kinds of satire. Another one of the rhetorical strategies I talked about toward the end of our last segment is what the Russian formalists, a group of Russian literary critics, called defamiliarizing or defamiliarization, which is to take something which has become all too familiar for us and by distorting it somewhat to present it in an unfamiliar way so that we can see it for what it really is. So that we can see it for what it really is. And we talked about that in some detail in certain kinds of examples and so forth. But I actually want to point you to some passages in Gulliver's Travels. And I realize that a number of people in the room here with me are using different editions of the text. And so the pagination with prose will not be the same from one text to another. We don't obviously have the same problem with poetry because the lines of poetry are going to be the same no matter what text you're using. So what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to point you to the chapter in the fourth part of Gulliver's Travels, and then I have counted up paragraphs. So I'll say things like the first passage I'm going to draw your attention to is in Gulliver's Travels, Part 4, Chapter 3, Paragraph 8. That's Chapter 3, Paragraph 8. Okay? Gulliver's Travels, Part 4, Chapter 3, Paragraph 8. And if that's true with the people here in the classroom with me, that's going to be even more true of many of you who are watching this on television, because I know that some of you will have older editions, some will have the current edition, and so forth. So it's a pretty simple matter. Just go to the beginning of a chapter and then just count the paragraphs as I do. Okay, this is the point at which Gulliver says he's going to reveal to the Wyndhams, particularly his Wyndham master, the secret of dress. Because notice, these are people who have never seen a clothed body. I mean, after all, horses obviously would not wear clothes. And the Yahoos apparently don't wear any kind of clothing. And so the Wyndhams look at him and they see him dressed in a certain way, and they simply assume that his clothes are part of what he is. So, look at this then, Part 4, Chapter 3, Paragraph 8. I had hitherto, this is of course Gulliver speaking, I had hitherto concealed the secret of my dress, in order to distinguish myself as much as possible from that cursed race of Yahoos, but now I found it in vain to do so any longer. Remember, that's part of the problem, is that he sees too much of an identification between himself and the savage and barbarous Yahoos, who, by the way, also are a kind of distorted, defamiliarizing device by which we see a certain aspect of human nature. Besides, I considered that my clothes and shoes would soon wear out, which already were in a declining condition, and must be supplied by some contrivance from the hides of Yahoos, or other brutes, whereby the whole secret would be known. I therefore told my master that in the country from whence I came, those of my kind always covered their bodies with the hairs of certain animals prepared by art, as well for decency as to avoid inclemencies of air both hot and cold, of which, as to my own person, I would give him immediate conviction, if he pleased to command me, only desiring his excuse, if I did not expose those parts that nature taught us to conceal. He said my discourse was all very strange, but especially the last part, for he could not understand why nature should teach us to conceal what nature had given, which of course in a way harkens back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before the fall, doesn't it? I mean, after all, if from Milton's Christian theological point of view, God has created human beings the way human beings exist, then there can be nothing shameful about human beings, right? And it's only after the fall that people begin to think that there is something shameful, perhaps, about their body or about parts of their body. Okay, so here we have a whole different perspective on the cultural value of clothing as presented to us through the eyes, as it were, of the Winhams. Okay, through the eyes of the Winhams, which presents us with the whole cultural issue of clothing and what clothing signifies for us in our kind of culture in the defamiliarized form of the comment of the Winham, the rational horse. Now, as we were talking about at the end of last class, however, we can't simply jump to the conclusion that the Winhams, therefore, represent the ideal for Swift, because, as we shall see, they are totally passionless and emotionless. And surely that would not be part of, or of what we would think of as ideal human condition. Okay, so turn over to chapter 5. Chapter 5. And go to the second paragraph in chapter 5. He starts talking about the wars of religion. Remember, we've talked about this here before. The English Civil War in the 1640s was, at least in part, a war of religion. The 30 Years' War that was taking place on the continent was, at least in large part, a war of religion. The war that took place in Ireland after the deposing of James II in 1688 was in part a war of religion. And so the master, the Winham master, asked Gulliver to explain, what are these things, these wars that you people have in your culture? So in obedience to his honor's commands, I related to him the resolution under the Prince of Orange, that's William of Orange, the long war with France entered into by the said prince, and renewed by his successor, the present queen, wherein the greatest powers of Christendom were engaged, and which still continued. I computed his request at about 1 million of yahoos. Notice that humans now are simply equated with yahoos in the view of both the Winham master and of Gulliver himself. That about 1 million of yahoos might have been killed in the whole progress of it, and perhaps 100 or more cities taken, and 5 times as many ships burned or sunk. He asked me what were the usual causes or motives that made one country go to war with another, which is a perfectly rational question, isn't it? I mean, why would anybody ever go to war with anybody else? I answered, they were innumerable, but I should only mention a few of the chief. Sometimes the ambition of princes, who never think they have land or people enough to govern. sometimes the corruption of ministers who engage their master in a war in order to stifle or divert the clamor of the subjects against their evil administration. In other words, politicians who take the country into war simply to conceal their own corruption or political ineptitude. Difference in opinions hath cost many millions of lives. Differences of opinions have cost many millions of lives. For instance, whether flesh be bread or bread be flesh, that's the whole argument between Protestants and Catholics over the sacrament of the Eucharist or communion, okay? Whether the juice of a certain berry be blood or wine, once again, a debate between Protestants and Catholics. Whether whistling be a vice or virtue, whether it be better to kiss a post or throw it into the fire. Here he's referring to a crucifix, by the way. What is the best color for a coat, whether black, white, red, or gray, which would be the different colors of the different uniforms, and whether it should be long or short, narrow or wide, dirty or clean, and many more. Neither are any wars so furious and bloody or of so long continuance as those occasioned by difference in opinion, especially if it be in things indifferent. That is to say, things that don't make any practical difference. Okay? And then at the end of the next paragraph, notice, the trade of a soldier is held the most honorable of all others, because a soldier is a Yahoo hired to kill in cold blood as many of his own species who have never offended him as possibly he can. See what's happening here? You know, I mean, in our long history, we have taken for granted the periodic upsurgence of warfare, right? And we've taken certain kinds of attitudes toward war and warfare and patriotism and so on and so on. What Swift is doing here is he is defamiliarizing that whole cultural attitude toward war. Okay, and of course that whole section goes on in the same kind of vein. At the end of chapter 6, look at the end of chapter 6. Second to last paragraph. I'm starting about 5 lines down in there. He's giving a description of our young noblemen. These are the noblemen of England, by the way, in his own time. Are bred from their childhood in idleness and luxury. In other words, what he's going to be saying is they're no good to anybody, and yet they have all the prestige, all the property, all the power, and so forth. They are bred from their childhood in idleness and luxury, that as soon as years will permit, they consume with vigor and contract odious diseases among lewd females. And of course, what he's talking about are sexually transmitted diseases. And when their fortunes are almost ruined, they marry some woman of mean birth, disagreeable person, and unsound constitution, merely for the sake of money, whom they hate and despise. That the productions of such marriages are generally scrofulous, rickety, or deformed children, by which means the family seldom continues above 3 generations, unless the wife take care to provide a healthy father among her neighbors or domestics in order to continue and improve and continue the breed. Notice the breed here. And of course what that means is, unless she takes lovers other than her husband in order to have children who don't suffer from the kinds of diseases that her noble husband does. That a weak, diseased body, a meager countenance, and sallow complexion are the true marks of noble blood, and a healthy, robust appearance is so disgraceful in a man of quality that the world concludes his real father to have been a groom or a coachman. The imperfections of his mind run parallel with those of his body, being a composition of spleen, dullness, ignorance, caprice, sensuality, and pride. And of course, you know, it's a joke among the English for many, many, many centuries that, you know, the nobility is very poorly educated and certainly not noted in general for wit, intelligence, or cultivation. The typical way in which people of the highest classes are educated is when they have their tutors and so forth, and sometimes go off to some sort of school where obviously they're going to be given very privileged kinds of positions and so forth. And traditionally, when they went off to university, they would be in residence at the university, and they would receive a degree which was called a passed degree, which means that they passed through the university. Most of the time perhaps drinking claret and having some of their friends in to their rooms. So there has not really been a tradition, as Swift is quick to point out, of there being a nobility which was particularly marked by its education, intelligence, cultivation, and so forth. Okay, but notice how this is presented to us. It's certainly not presented to us in the way that we would normally find it. This is, once again, to take something which is familiar and to present it to us in a defamiliarized or unfamiliar way so that we see it anew, perhaps for the first time. I am going to direct you to chapter 8 now. And this is the famous passage where the female Yahoo accosts him, actually tries to sexually assault him. In paragraph 3, at the end of it, it is observed that the red-haired of both sexes are more libidinous and mischievous than the rest, whom they yet much exceed in strength and activity. And then go down 1, 2, 3 paragraphs. And so Gulliver decides to bathe in a river that was near. I immediately stripped myself stark naked and went down softly into the stream. It happened that a young female Yahoo, standing behind the bank, saw the whole proceeding, and inflamed by desire, as the nag and I conjectured, the nag being a Wynnum, came running with all speed and leaped into the water within 5 yards of the place where I bathed. I was never in my life so terribly frighted. The nag was grazing at some distance, not suspecting any harm. She embraced me after a most fulsome manner. I roared as loud as I could, and the nag came galloping toward me, whereupon she, the female Yahoo, quitted her grasp with the utmost reluctance and leaped upon the opposite bank, where she stood gazing and howling all the time I was putting on my clothes. Okay, you know, this is actually the reverse of the kind of thing that was done in all of those films about the, what? Well, yeah, that's true, but I'm thinking of the, yeah, that's true too, but I was thinking of the Planet of the Apes. You seen those movies, the Planet of the Apes? Where humans now find themselves in a planet, in a foreign land, in which the apes are the ones who run things, and they're the ones who are intelligent, and they're the ones who have science and mathematics and the arts and so forth, and human beings are simply assumed to be yahoos, like Swift's yahoos. Okay, so now, he says in the next paragraph, I could no longer deny that I was a real Yahoo in every limb and feature, since the females had a natural propensity to me as one of their own species, Neither was the hair of this brute of a red color, which might have been some excuse for the appetite, a little irregular, but black as a sloe. And of course, he's having fun with this business of, red hair and so forth. Remember now he's living in Ireland, where certainly not everybody, but there are a lot of people with red hair, just as there are in Scotland and in the northern and eastern parts of England. Okay, so in paragraph 9, notice that the Wenhams are very concerned to cultivate reason, and in paragraph 11, notice their view of marriage. This is the paragraph that begins, when the matron Wenhams, everybody with me? When the matron Wenhams have produced one of each sex, they no longer accompany with their consorts, except they lose one of their issue by some casualty, which very seldom happens. And this goes on, by the way, so that marriage, courtship, sexuality, and so forth are presented to us in a totally passionless, unemotional way. That the only reason that these reasonable creatures have for ever having any kind of physical contact with one another is in order to produce offspring. And once they have produced offspring, then there's no reasonable reason for them to have any further sexual relations. Okay, so see, that's the other side of it. While on the one hand, we might think, well, wouldn't it be wonderful for human beings to be as reasonable as the Wenhams are presented to us here? Well, but it's reason, in effect, gone to such extremes that there's no emotion at all, no passion at all. Okay, in chapter 11, and we're not going to have an opportunity really to go into this, but I just note the fact that this is where he encounters Captain Pedro de Mendes. We talked about him last time, as really being the ideal figure in Gulliver's Travels. He's a very reasonable person, but he's also a very kind and compassionate person. He is emotional as well as intelligent and rational. And in particular, he has fellow feeling for someone in the plight in which he finds Gulliver. So while neither the Yahoos nor the Wenhams represent the ideal of human nature, Pedro de Mendes does seem to represent that. Not to Gulliver, but to us, by implication. And then look at chapter 12. This will be the last passage in Gulliver's Travels we're going to look at right now. Chapter 12, and count your paragraphs until you get to paragraph 7. Okay, this is the paragraph that begins, "But I had another reason." Okay, and what he's going to do is he's going to talk about what colonization is. Now remember, this is the great period of colonization by England and other European powers who were going all over the globe and staking their claim to lands all over planet Earth, right? And that was simply taken for granted. That's what the great powers were supposed to do. Well, look at it. So he's going to talk about why he doesn't want to discuss with his fellow Englishmen back home, now that he's back home, the lands that he discovered. Why? Because they're going to want to rush out there and colonize them. So here's a reason which makes him less than forward to enlarge his Majesty's dominions, the king's dominions. By my discoveries, to say the truth, I had conceived a few scruples with relation to the distributive justice of princes upon those occasions. For instance, a crew of pirates are driven by a storm they know not whither. At length a boy discovers land from the topmast. They go on shore to rob and plunder. They see a harmless people, are entertained with kindness. They give the country a new name. They take formal possession of it for the king. They set up a rotten plank or a stone for a memorial. They murder 2 or 3 dozen of the natives, bring away a couple more by force for a sample, return home and get their pardon. Here commences a new dominion acquired with a title by divine right, capital D, capital R. Ships are sent with the first opportunity, the natives driven out or destroyed, their princes tortured to discover their gold, a free license given to all acts of inhumanity and lust, the earth reeking with the blood of its inhabitants, and this execrable crew of butchers employed in so pious an expedition is a modern colony sent to convert and civilize an idolatrous and barbarous people. Well, notice how savagely he is attacking the whole practice of colonialism here. But that's something which was largely taken for granted by the English and other Europeans at the time. And what he's doing here is to present this in a form from a perspective which is not familiar, so that the familiar practices of colonization will be seen in a new way for what they really are. Okay? And this is really the greatness of Swift, is his genius for being able to get us to look at things in a fresh way, ways that we haven't looked at them before. And not only in Gullivers Travels, but also, as we saw in our last segment, in A Modest Proposal. Okay, now let's move along to recognize that there are some signs of change occurring in the 18th century. And if we can go to the PowerPoint, please. Let's see. We go to the PowerPoint. We have signs of change in the later 18th century. We're going to be looking at 2 poems, Gray's Elegy written in a country churchyard, and then Goldsmith's Deserted Village. And in these, we're going to see an attitude towards rural life and nature beginning to develop, which we haven't really seen before, at least not developed in the ways that we will now begin to see it. And this is going to be a celebration of the virtues, not of city life, but of rural life, and of living close to nature. Which, of course, is leading into Romanticism that's going to be emerging toward the end of the 18th century and then in the early decades of the 19th century. And while that part of the story is beyond the limit of this course, that's where we begin the follow-up course, British Literature 2. Okay, so I'm simply telling you now that a momentous change, cultural change, is just beginning to occur, though it would have been very difficult for people at the time to have seen the immensity of what was coming. Much late 18th century literature, as I already noted in the PowerPoint presentation, is marked by a kind of sentimentalism. And sentimentalism in the 18th century means a little something different than it means for us. It means an emphasis on sentiment or emotion. An emphasis on sentiment, which was an 18th century word for emotion. A cultivation of what was considered to be the sublime. Remember at the end of last class I said that, or was it the class? Well, anyway, it was in our discussion of neoclassicism that until the Romantics came along, people thought that the Alps were simply a nuisance because they got in the way of travel and commerce. But now with the Romantics, here are people who are going on trips so that they can experience the awesome nature of nature in such incredible visions as those of the Alps. Okay, this is what they meant by the sublime, the feeling of being lifted up out of oneself and transported into some other spiritual and imaginative plane by a new connection with nature. And of course, something that we're not taking up directly here is the development of the novel. The development of the novel as an art form. And I know some of you have been working on your term papers, writing on novels. The novel really is novel, and nobody knew quite what to call it. And they simply called it the novel, which simply means a new thing, right? And the novel has been especially resistant to any kind of generic definition. And one of the things that marks the novel as a form then and now is the constant experimentation with different forms of narration in different kinds of novels. So, the novel also rises as a popular art form at precisely the time that we begin to see the ascendancy of a new middle class, becoming more and more affluent and more firmly entrenched in positions of power, in England particularly. And this creates a whole audience for novels. Some of them are romantic novels set in faraway places or in faraway times with unusual, even supernatural events occurring. Some of them deal with manners, that is to say, the manners of everyday life. You know, people being born, growing up, getting educated, perhaps going through periods of courtship, marriage, other kinds of adventures of the kinds that are available to ordinary people, or more or less ordinary people. Not simply the great adventures of people who go out on explorations or performing heroic deeds in warfare. Okay, leading toward the kind of novel of manners that we find in and comedies of manners that we find in various writers, Fielding to a certain extent, Fanny Burney to a certain extent in the 18th century, certainly leading toward someone like Jane Austen in the early 19th century. Okay, but let's come back to Gray. And let's look at his elegy written in a country churchyard. It opens with a celebration of humble rural life. Not of the great life of nobles or generals, heroic figures. There's nothing epic here, but rather the reverse. A celebration of humble rural life and of humble rural people, which of course is most of the people. Certainly in Gray's time, it was the vast majority of people. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Okay, this is the local church, they're ringing the bell. Okay. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lay. The plowman homeward plods his weary way and leaves the world to darkness and to me, the poet who's watching all of this. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower the moping owl does to the moon complain of such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. And notice here, beneath those rugged elms that yew trees shade where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. This is the graveyard. This is the village graveyard, okay? Where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap. This is the roundedness of the grave, okay? Where each in his narrow cell, like a monk's cell. This is the grave, forever laid. The rude in the sense of rustic. Rude didn't used to mean what we mean by rude. Rustic country forefathers of the hamlet sleep. The breezy call of incense-breathing morn, the swallow twittering from the straw-built shed, the cock's shrill clarion or the echoing horn, no more shall rouse them from their lowly bed. For them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, no busy housewife ply her evening care, no children run to lisp their sire's return, or climb his knees the envied kiss to share. Oft did the harvest to their sickle yield, their furrow oft the stubborn glebe has broke. How jocund did they drive their team afield, how bowed the woods beneath their sturdy stroke. But then notice the shift. There's a marked shift right here. In my book, I've drawn a line right across the page at this point. Let not ambition mock their useful toil. Let not people who are ambitious to rise in the world and think of themselves as what my aunt used to call high mucky mucks. Let such persons not mock the useful toil of these common, ordinary people, these farmers, okay, who are living the best kind of life according to Gray, quite unlike those who are constantly pushing themselves ahead to become great, quote, successes. Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys and destiny obscure, nor grandeur hear with a disdainful smile the short and simple annals of the poor. The boast of heraldry, the pomp of power, and all that beauty, all that wealth e'er gave, awaits alike the inevitable hour. And of course, here's a line that you've probably heard before. It's a very famous line in poetry in the English language. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. That's also, by the way, the title of an absolutely wonderful movie, The Paths of Glory. Okay. Of course, the line is taken from here, for the film. So what is he saying here in this quatrain? What he's saying is, so what? Somebody becomes rich or powerful or, quote, successful according to the norms of the world, the great world. So what? Ultimately, the paths of glory lead but to the grave. Okay? And so he thinks about what might have been, perhaps in this neglected spot, this is 45 and following, is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire. Who knows? maybe here in one of these graves that he's now meditating on was somebody who could have been a great poet or a great artist. Who knows? Hands of somebody else that the rod of empire might have swayed, or wake to ecstasy the living lyre. Could have been a great musician. But, see, they were thwarted. But knowledge to their eyes, her ample page, rich with the spoils of time, did ne'er unroll. In other words, they never had the education to do any of those kinds of things. Chill penury repressed their noble rage and froze the genial current of the soul. Penury, poverty, absolute abject poverty. And then notice, full many a gem of purest ray serene, the dark unfathomed caves of ocean bare. And then, we've heard this before too, full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Well, okay. Many a beautiful person, many a wonderful person, many a very gifted person may be born to blush unseen. Okay? Just because somebody has grown up in rural circumstances and doesn't have the same opportunities as others does not mean that the person didn't have a kind of greatness of her or his own. See, some village Hampden with that dauntless breast the little tyrant of his fields withstood. Some mute inglorious Milton here may rest. Some Cromwell guiltless of his country's blood. Notice that these, by the way, the applause of listening sentence to command, the threats of pain and ruin to despise, to scatter plenty or a smiling land, and read their history in a nation's eyes, their lot forbade. See, they never had the opportunity to do those things, nor circumscribed alone their growing virtues, but their crimes confined. Forbade to wade through slaughter to a throne, and shut the gates of mercy on mankind. See, they were never even given the opportunity to wade through slaughter to a throne and shut the gates of mercy on mankind. They lived, in line 73, far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife. Far from the madding crowd, and far from the madding crowd, that's another one of those things that we've heard often enough. And that also becomes the title of a famous novel. Their sober wishes never learned to stray. In other words, they were never really tempted by the things of the world that people who marvel at their own, quote, success have been tempted by and even corrupted by. In other words, it really is a good thing to grow up in a small rural setting. And one has even greater opportunities for moral growth and moral improvement. So then we have in 93 and following, for thee, and now we have a direct address to somebody, the reader apparently, who mindful of the unhonored dead dost in these lines their artless tale relate, if chance by lonely contemplation led, some kindred spirit shall inquire thy fate. You see, this is like Donne's ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. You see, ask not who the dead are, you will be one of the dead shortly enough. So with this melancholy thought, notice what Gray is really doing here. He's not only suggesting that death is the great leveler, which was a kind of commonplace in poetry from ancient times onward, that all will die, whether they be emperors or servants. And after one dies, what difference does it really make, whether one was an emperor or a servant? But then secondly, notice that he is celebrating the life of the ordinary person who leads not a life of great glory and great success, but a life which is marked by routine, decency, hard work, good values, and then ultimately goes to his resting place here in the country churchyard. Now, this is the sense in which I'm saying this is looking forward now in the direction of the kind of poetry you're going to see in the Romantics, who likewise are entranced with rural settings, getting out into nature, celebrating people like Wordsworth's Michael, who's a very ordinary kind of guy, who's a shepherd, in fact, or celebrating farmers and the families of farmers in Romantic poetry. Okay, and then let's look at one other poem here. This is Goldsmith's Deserted Village. Goldsmith, like Swift, was one of the Anglo-Irish. He was born and reared in Ireland, educated in Ireland, and then left Ireland and traveled all over the place. Ended up as part of Samuel Johnson's famous circle of literary figures and wits and so forth. And Goldsmith wrote a number of different things. He wrote a novel, The Vicar of Wakefield. He wrote some very famous plays, especially She Stoops to Conquer, which is still performed, by the way. And here a poem which had a good deal of influence, like Gray's Elegy, on readers of the time. Once again, notice the celebration of village life. Here it's a kind of sentimental and romanticized view of village life that is here idealized. Sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, where healthy and plenty cheered the laboring swain, where smiling spring its earliest visit paid, and parting summer's lingering blooms delayed. Dear lovely bowers of innocence and ease, seats of my youth, when every sport could please, how often have I loitered o'er thy green, where humble happiness endeared each scene. How often have I paused on every charm, the sheltered cot, the cultivated farm, the never-failing brook, the busy mill, the decent church that topped the neighboring hill. I mean, can't you just see this picture of a little English village, you know, as idealized in this poem? Okay, and in lots of movie versions of English village life, like Agatha Christie mysteries and so on and so on. The hawthorn bush with seats beneath the shade for talking age and whispering lovers made. How often have I blessed the coming day when toil remitting lent its turn to play, and all the village train from labor free led up their sports beneath the spreading tree, while many a pastime circled in the shade, the young contending as the old surveyed. Okay, and it goes on in exactly this way, and how here are people with their innocent pleasures living out close to nature in this little village. But And here I've once again drawn a line across my page, after line 34, because notice, these were thy charms. All these things that I've been talking about, these were thy charms. And then notice the dash. But all these charms are fled. Because remember, this is the deserted village. Sweet smiling village, loveliest of the lawn, thy sports are fled, and all thy charms withdrawn. Amidst thy bowers the tyrant's hand is seen, and desolation saddens all thy green. Only master grasps the whole domain. What is he talking about? This is not the first time that the English government, particularly through Parliament, had enacted enclosure acts. But there was in this time, in this period, in the 18th century, a very famous and devastating enclosure act. And what the enclosure act meant was enclosing lands as private lands and cutting them off from public use by very wealthy people who wanted to extend their very large estates, because they were becoming incredibly wealthy in England. I mean, a small class of people were becoming incredibly wealthy in the 18th century. And they were building those huge manor houses. And they would have hundreds and in some cases thousands of acres of land that was cut off from common use. But going back to the Middle Ages, there had always been common land so that small farmers not only had the plots of land which they could use to cultivate their crops, but they also had access to common land that everybody could share in. That was what was being enclosed. And people could no longer subsist through farming, and they were being driven off of their farms, out of their villages, and into cities like London that in the 18th century doubled and then tripled in size within decades, with all of the problems that came along with that. The alcoholism that was rife in what was called Gin Alley. Prostitution became suddenly very, very common. All kinds of thievery became very, very common. For the first time, it became necessary to actually have a police force. There was no police force in London until the beginning of the 19th century, after all of this happened. So there was a population explosion in the cities. And this population explosion in the cities was an explosion of people who were agricultural workers and who were not trained for city-type jobs. And so they took whatever kind of employment they could get, but there were only so many jobs that were available to them, given their lack of skills. And the economy simply couldn't grow fast enough to accommodate them. And so what we find in this poem is a celebration again and again, if you go through the entire poem, of the people who used to live in villages like this. The local vicar, the clergyman, a good, decent person. The local schoolmaster, a good, intelligent person. The people who used to gather at the community center of the tavern, drink beer, share stories, live their lives together. That now is all being passed away by these enclosure acts, forcing people off the land and into the corruptions of the city. That is leading to Romanticism. Okay.